So happy Easter. And so our topic tonight is the figures of the sacrifice of the Eucharist. And so how God prepared for that aspect of the Eucharist as sacrifice. So we saw in our first talk that Jesus instituted the Eucharist for not just for one reason or even just for two, but for three, in some sense, equally important reasons. To dwell among us with his real presence, to feed us with that very presence and life, and then to be given in sacrifice on our altars with that very same body, blood that was immolated on Calvary, so that it could be offered every day in the church as the church's sacrifice. And so in the last talk, we looked at the figures in the Old Testament of the first two, of the real presence and of spiritual nourishment. And so in this talk, we'll look at how God prepared for the Eucharist as sacrifice in the Old Covenant. And here it's actually, there are even more figures of the Eucharist as sacrifice than there are of the Eucharist as presence and as spiritual nourishment. But what's beautiful, we'll see at the end, is that they all go together. That very often precisely the types of presence and nourishment are intrinsically joined to the preparations for the Eucharist as sacrifice. So we could say basically all of the liturgy of Israel was a preparation for the Eucharist as sacrifice. But also very many of the key events of Israel's life as well. In particular, the sacrifice of Isaac. There's a beautiful homily from the 2nd century, the middle of the 2nd century, by Saint Melito of Sardis, that the church has in the Divine Office on Monday of Easter week, so 2 days ago. Those of you who pray the Divine Office would have read this. And it speaks about these figures of this of Christ's sacrifice, but therefore also of the Eucharist as sacrifice. And so St. Melito says, and this homily would be an Easter homily. He who was led away as a lamb and was sacrificed as a sheep, by himself delivered us from servitude to the world, as from the land of Egypt. Right? So Christ is the new Paschal Lamb. And released us from bondage to the devil as from the hand of Pharaoh, and sealed our souls by his own Spirit, and the members of our bodies by his own blood. This is he who covered death with shame, and who plunged the devil into mourning, as Moses did Pharaoh. This is he who delivered us from slavery into freedom, from darkness into light, from death into life, from tyranny into an eternal kingdom, who made us a new priesthood and a chosen people forever. This is he who is the Passover of our salvation. This is the one murdered in Abel, bound in sacrifice in Isaac, exiled in Jacob, sold in Joseph, exposed in Moses, sacrificed in the Lamb. This is the Lamb that was slain. This is the Lamb that was silent. This is the one who was born of Mary, that beautiful ewe lamb. This is the one who was taken from the flock and dragged to sacrifice and was killed in the evening and buried at night. Right, so that's all recalling the rite of the Passover. He was to be the Passover lamb, taken from the flock on the 10th of Nisan and sacrificed in the evening twilight, buried at night. The one who was not broken while on the tree, who did not see dissolution while in the earth, who rose up from the dead and raised up mankind from the grave below. So Christ's sacrifice recapitulates, we could say, the whole history of the chosen people, and especially their worship. And that sacrifice is made present in the Eucharist, and so therefore that whole worship prefigured the Eucharist as sacrifice. So let's look at these figures in more detail. So priesthood and sacrifice always go together. So wherever we find a priesthood, we find sacrifice being offered, and vice versa. Wherever we find sacrifice, we find a priesthood ordained to offer that sacrifice. And the reason for this is because man is a social being. And so instead of each individual offering his own sacrifice, and thus every man being his own priest, since we're social beings, it's fitting that one offer on behalf of the many. That the head of a society, say the head of a family, of a clan, offer on behalf of the whole family or clan. And so we find in the early patriarchs, it's the patriarchs who are priests of their clan or extended family. And the priest is ordained precisely to offer sacrifices to God. So it marks all of human history, the offering of sacrifice. We find it at the very dawn of human history after the fall, Genesis 4. Practically the first thing we read about is Adam and Eve having relations and Cain and Abel being born. But then the next thing we read is that in the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground, and Abel brought of the firstlings of his flock and their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. And so practically the first thing that's recorded of our life after the fall is the offering of sacrifice. And of the same kinds of sacrifices that Israel would offer. In other words, the fruits of basically that which nourishes human life. Right? So the fruit of the harvest and the fruit of the flocks. And then after the flood, we see the first thing that Noah does is offer sacrifice. Noah built an altar to the Lord and took of every clean animal and every clean bird and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth, and never will I again destroy every living creature as I have done. And so we see that Noah, in offering that sacrifice, is acting as a mediator between humanity, of which he is the new head, and God. And we see this mediation having two directions. So if Noah offers a sacrifice up to God and wins through that offering a blessing on mankind. And so we've seen this again and again. This is the structure of the Eucharist. An offering up to God, sacrifice, and the winning of all kinds of blessings. And so every sacrifice has that ascending direction to win God's blessings descending upon us. Okay. And every culture bears out this what we read in the Bible. Every culture offers sacrifice, and the same kinds of sacrifices: bloody sacrifices of livestock, of the flocks, and cereal offerings, wine offerings. Okay. I don't know if I mentioned. Did I mention Jericho? No. Yeah. So when I studied for a year in the Holy Land, and with the Franciscans, and they would take us on archaeological expeditions every 2 weeks. And so one of the places they took us was to visit the city of Jericho, which has a good claim to being regarded as the oldest city on earth, or perhaps not the present Jericho, but what's below it. And so you get there, and there's a kind of an artificial hill, and what they've done is they've dug, in the mid-20th century, they did an archaeological dig going down, and these old cities are elevated above the surrounding terrain. I didn't tell this? No. And so, because the city was destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed and rebuilt, so you get a kind of artificial hill. And so they dug down, and you can kind of date each meter, I don't know how many hundreds of years would represent. And they got to what looked like virgin soil, but it was still higher than the surrounding terrain. And so the head of the archaeological dig said, no, keep on digging. And so they dug, 8 meters of dirt, and came across another city below it, which now was on the right level, the level of the surrounding ground. And the thing that they happened to find, just where that excavation was an altar. So this earliest city, which was dated to about 7,000 BC, with a different kind of, they didn't have the potter's wheel, so it's a culture before the potter's wheel, but they had an altar. And that's just exactly where the dig happened to, what had happened to unearth. Just simply as a kind of type example of the ubiquity of the offering of sacrifice. Wherever there are human bones, we can be pretty sure we'll find remains of sacrifice and human burials, so religious offerings. So what we want to look at here is why is it so universal that every culture offers sacrifice, and especially in Israel, in the Mosaic Law. And so we'll look at especially the offering of sacrifice in Israel. We see sacrifice again with Abraham. Right? So Abraham, as the head of the clan, sacrifices. And so he offers different kinds of sacrifices to seal the covenant in Genesis 17. But the most solemn and momentous is when he's asked to sacrifice Isaac. So the sacrifice of Isaac is kind of the classic sacrifice of Abraham. And so here too we find the same two movements of the offering, or at least the willingness to offer, and the blessing that results from it. But obviously the peculiarity here is that Abraham is asked uniquely to offer his own son, but not just any son, precisely the son of the promise. Right? So the son, that was the subject of all the drama of the preceding chapters, in which Abraham was promised a son in whom he would have descendants as many as the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky, and not only that, in whom all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Right? He had to wait for that promise to be realized, even though his wife was too old and barren on top of it. He had to wait 25 more years. Finally, the son is born, and then God asks that very son of the promise to be sacrificed. And Abraham's readiness to offer it, and his actually setting in movement is what wins the reaffirmation, God swearing by his own self that blessing that he had promised earlier, that in Isaac all nations, in Abraham's seed, all nations would be blessed. And so it's a messianic blessing. It's the promise of Jesus Christ. And so the offering is remembered in the Roman canon of the Mass, right, as a type of Christ's sacrifice. And it's beautiful to go through the details of it. So we've seen Isaac is a figure of Christ, right? So Isaac, who is offered, and he's a figure of Christ because of his innocence, but much more importantly, because he's the promise. Right? So Isaac was the promised son, but he's promised precisely as pre-containing, as it were, Jesus Christ, being his great-great-great-great-grandfather. And so Isaac is a figure of Christ as the son of the promise. Abraham is a figure of God the Father, right, who sacrifices his son on Calvary, or allows him to be sacrificed. Abraham is also a type of faith in the resurrection of Christ, right? Because Abraham sacrifices the son of the promise only because he believes that God can still bring about the promise even if he sacrifices him. And so that presupposes that Abraham is believing that God can raise Isaac from the dead. And this is spelled out in the letter to the Hebrews, that Abraham is the model of faith because he believed that God could raise up his son Isaac even after he was sacrificed. And so in that, Abraham is the type of our faith in Christ's resurrection. And then there are the other details. Isaac carries the wood, as Christ carried the wood of the cross. And then the fact, so Abraham is spared, right? A ram is substituted, and that too is a figure of Christ, the ram as a vicarious offering. But so here the figure falls short. Isaac was spared, but God did not spare his only son, but gave him up for us all. That's Romans 8:32. And then finally, when Isaac is carrying the wood, he asks Abraham, here's the wood, here's the fire, where's the sacrifice? And Abraham responds with this magnificent line, God will provide. Right? And that too is a figure, right? Because Isaac was a figure of another sacrifice that God alone would provide, the perfect sacrifice, Christ on Calvary, which made present in the Eucharist. Right? So what no mere man could accomplish, the Lord provided in his incarnation, passion, and in the Eucharist. Okay, so that's kind of the most dramatic sacrifice of the patriarchs. But we see Isaac and Jacob continuing to offer sacrifice as the head of the family. They built altars, they offered sacrifices on them, Bethel. And through that offering, they won graces for themselves, the same structure of offering and blessing. So that continues until we get the Mosaic covenant and the law of Moses, giving a new form to the sacrifices of Israel. So let's look at that. Now again, it's easy to miss this if you look at contemporary Judaism, because in contemporary Judaism there are no sacrifices. So that aspect has been lost for 19 centuries because of the destruction of the temple. And so... Mm-hmm.
And was that the only place where they could offer sacrifices? I mean, did they have synagogues back then?
Synagogue was for the liturgy of the word, but the sacrificial liturgy had to be in the place that God appointed. In other words, it had to be in one place, and precisely that place where God indwelt. So we can see, again, how God is bringing together these different figures that are prefiguring the Eucharist. The indwelling of God with his people, called the Shekinah, which was in the temple, in one place, was the same place where sacrifice had to... In other words, sacrifice couldn't be just offered anywhere, because it had to be offered before the face of God. Well, God dwelt in Israel in one place. Right? And that it was, at first, a movable place, because it was the tent of meeting that was carried with Israel in the desert for 40 years, but then brought into the chosen land, to the land of Israel, and finally planted permanently in Jerusalem with David and Solomon. Right? So once that happened, all sacrifice had to be offered there and only there. And there are many texts that spell this out in Deuteronomy, that God will establish a place. The book of Deuteronomy doesn't say where, because it wasn't yet made known. It would be centuries later when David would make that place Jerusalem. But the law of Moses stipulates that it be offered only in the place that God would appoint. So when that place got destroyed, first in the exile 600 BC, and then in 70 AD again, with the destruction of the temple by the Roman legions under the Emperor Titus, never to be rebuilt, no sacrifice could be offered anymore in Israel, even though the priesthood continues. Right? So there still is a Jewish priesthood, and it's hereditary, right? So it's the sons of Aaron, and it's made known by family lineage. And so someone who's of the priestly line has a name that indicates it. And generally it's Cohen, which is the Hebrew word for priest, Cohen, or a derivative of it, Khan, Kagan, Kaganovich, some form of Cohen indicates the priestly line. It's also indicated on tombstones to show that genealogy. Right, so the priesthood continues, but the problem is they can't offer sacrifice because it has to be offered only in the temple. And so it's a priesthood that can only bless but can't offer. In other words, they can only do this part but without this part. Gloria?
And if you're going to talk about this later
Mm-hmm.
on, so when it was the meeting place was in the tent of dwelling or the tent of meeting, whatever you call it, wouldn't God come in the form of a cloud?
Mm-hmm. Right. So God would show his indwelling by even a sensible phenomenon of the cloud, which is also manifesting that, yes, he's dwelling there, but it's completely a mysterious presence, and God is infinitely transcendent above all understanding and vision.
So did he supposedly stay there, or did he come there and meet them and then he would leave?
No, he would stay. Even though the visible manifestation wouldn't, I suppose, always be there. But in the desert, it was. And when it would, he would lead the people, basically. When the cloud was raised, etc., that was the time for them to move on. But then the cloud, when Solomon built the temple, the cloud descended on the Holy of Holies. But in the Babylonian captivity, just before the destruction of the temple, Ezekiel has a vision. So Ezekiel has been taken captive before the temple is destroyed, at the time of the Babylonian captivity. But he has a vision of the unworthiness of Israel and the cloud being lifted, that presence, from the temple shortly before its destruction. Yeah. I don't know if the cloud came back to the second temple. We're not told. But right, but nevertheless, that's right, exactly. Mm-hmm. And the Ark of the Covenant was also lost, never to be recovered. Okay, so yes, this aspect of blessing still remains. And so in his synagogue today, at the end, priests are asked to give the priestly blessing, the blessing of that's given in the book of Numbers. But that's all that they can do. Right? So the synagogue service has no aspect of sacrifice other than the sacrifice of praise, basically the liturgy of the word. And so we could say the form of Judaism was radically and catastrophically changed by the loss of the temple. And so we have to put ourselves back in the earlier, in other words, in the life of Israel when the temple still stood. That's what we're going to try and do here, and look at what that was like. All right, so the principle, the liturgy of Israel didn't center on the synagogue. Every community had a synagogue in which you would go on the Sabbath for the liturgy of the word. But in the temple, sacrifice was offered daily. We'll go through them all. So every day, twice a day, sacrifice was offered. Double on the Sabbath. Septuple on the new moon, etc. And we'll go through it all. Right? And so that's the principal task of the priest, is that offering of sacrifice. And the priest would live from it as well, because they received a special portion from most of the sacrifices. And all of these sacrifices centered, they were... So first let's look, why sacrifice and what is sacrifice? So there's a famous definition of St. Augustine of sacrifice from his classic work, The City of God. He says, we are to understand that, he's speaking about pagan sacrifices and the Jewish sacrifices of the law. He said, we're to understand that the significance of those acts was the same as those now performed in the church. Right? So the sacrifices of Israel had the same purpose as the sacrifice that is offered every day on all the altars in the Catholic world. We've lost that connection. This is a huge challenge for catechesis and the new evangelization. People have no idea that that's what the Mass is about. But for St. Augustine, it's obvious. We're doing the same thing that they were doing, but in a different form and in an infinitely better way. And he says the purpose of it is to offer something so as to bring about a holy fellowship with God. That's the purpose of sacrifice, which is basically the purpose of religion. The word religion means to bind back. So re is the back, and then ligare is to bind. So religion means binding us back to God. In other words, establishing a fellowship with God that was lost in the fall and that existed in Eden. And so to reestablish that fellowship, and to reestablish it by giving, by a mutual exchange, we could say, by the offering of sacrifice so as to win God's blessing and fellowship. So it's a kind of interchange, which is the whole structure of Christianity and of all religion. And so acts done to cleave to God and to seek. But he says the visible sacrifice is the sacrament or sacred sign of an invisible sacrifice. So in every sacrifice, there's an exterior offering. An exterior, a sensible, and a social offering of what, which represents an invisible interior offering. So actually the heart of every sacrifice is unseen. It's the immolation of the heart. And we read about this, for example, in Psalm 51, this great penitential psalm of David. In verse 17, he says, "The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, a humbled heart, you will not despise." And so that would be the invisible sacrifice of the heart. But it's represented exteriorly by the offering of something else that manifests it sensibly and socially. And so we could say that the sacrifice, the visible sacrifice, is the sacrament, meaning sacred sign, efficacious sacred sign of the invisible interior offering. Right? And just that would mean that if we go to Mass and we're there bodily but not distracted doing something else interiorly, we've missed the heart of the matter, right? Which is the. But it's now somebody today. I think the temptation is a kind of dualism, an either or. So people have the idea, well, if I do the offering of the heart, what do I need the exterior for? And that's because we're not angels. If we were angels, in the angelic worship in heaven, there's no visible sacrifice. Because they're pure spirits. They don't need sensible representation, and they don't need the social form of sacrifice. Right? But we're bodily and social beings. And so therefore, what happens inside our hearts needs to be expressed externally, visibly, and has to take a social form. Right? Because we're not islands, each person to himself. And so basically, because of human nature, sacrifice has to always have this exterior dimension to represent an interior oblation or gift to God. That ought to be total, because we've received everything from Him. And if it's not total, it won't. So the purpose of this is to establish fellowship with God. In other words, union with God. By a mutual self-gift. Obviously, God gives Himself to us first. We give back, and then He gives Himself to us in response to our gift. And it creates a kind of spiral. In other words, it makes a circular movement. Okay, so sacrifice is, we could say, an act of the virtue of religion. Now again, for Aquinas, for Cicero, religion was thought of as a virtue. To us, that sounds totally foreign. So it's worthwhile saying something about that. A virtue is a habit of doing good acts. All right. Giving honor to God and living and acting in such a way so as to establish union with God is obviously a good thing, and a supremely good thing. And therefore the habit of seeking to bring this about, of seeking to give glory to God and enter into fellowship with Him, is supremely virtuous. And so that's why for the classical philosophers, religion is a virtue. And of all the moral virtues, in some ways the most important, because having the highest object. Right? It's not actually the highest virtue, because it's underneath faith, hope, and charity. It serves faith, hope, and charity. And charity has to be the queen of religion. And we can see it right here. Charity manifests itself in the interior sacrifice, which the exterior is expressing. Right? So the virtue of religion is in service of charity, but above the other moral virtues. Right? And sacrifice is a key act of the virtue of religion. And again, our challenge today is that this is completely lost in modern society. The idea that it would be virtuous to offer sacrifice to God. And that if a person never thought of offering anything to God, that would be a vice. The vice of irreligion. And in fact, religious life is all about the virtue of religion. And it's consecrating oneself for the virtue of religion, to make one's whole life an offering. And that's what makes it such a great state of life. Okay. Right, so sacrifice is a key act of the virtue of religion. And St. Thomas Aquinas argues that the offering of sacrifice is part of natural law. And that's why we see it in all the cultures of the world. Because it's part of natural law in a similar way to thou shalt not kill. It's not as, perhaps to us, it's much less immediate. But nevertheless, it's something written on the heart. And that's why we find it in all cultures. And the reason we've already explained, it's because we have bodily nature, it's not enough to have the interior recognition of God's dominion, but we need to express it exteriorly. Just as we express the honor to a president or to a king or to our parents externally, so too we need to express externally an honor proper to God alone. And that's what sacrifice is. Giving something that can only be given to God as a token of His dominion. Right? As a token of the fact that He is the source of every good. Right? So the first reason for offering sacrifice is adoration, to adore God as the Creator. And then secondly, to thank Him for having given us everything that we have. And so it would go together with the virtue of gratitude. And then third, once sin has entered into the world, there's a new reason to offer sacrifice, to make satisfaction for sin. In other words, to offer something in addition. So even if there had been no sin, we'd still need to do this to recognize His lordship. But once there's sin, we need to do it, in some sense, by a new title and infinitely more, to compensate for the infinite gravity of offending the infinite God. And so that would be the third reason. And then we also need to offer sacrifice to accompany our petitions as a way of manifesting that we're completely dependent on God. And that asking for His gifts, it's proper that we also seek to give Him something in return. Right, so those are the four reasons of sacrifice, are also the four ends of prayer. Adoration, thanksgiving, sacrifice for sin, or expressing contrition for sin, seeking to make atonement for sin, and then finally, supplication or petition. Right, so those are the reasons kind of the global reasons for praying, and they're the same reasons for giving sacrifice to God. And so what is offered in sacrifice? It's interesting that in all the cultures of the world, pretty much there's a kind of unanimity that what should be offered to God is not dead things, inanimate things, gold and jewels, but precisely that which gives life. And so we find the culture of the world offering, like Cain and Abel, cereal offerings and animal offerings. Precisely those animals that sustain human life, and the bread that sustains human life, and also, maybe to a lesser extent, the wine that sustains human life. So what's offered is precisely what is life-giving. And so God gives us life, and so it's fitting that we try to give back life to Him. And so all of those things represent the life, and in a particular way, the blood of the animal represents the life. And we speak that way too. We speak about lifeblood, right? Our life, and if we lose too much blood, we die. And so for primitive man, but not without reason, blood is seen to be the seat of life. Blood in the heart, right? And so offering, if you want to express that God has given us life and all good things, and we want to give something back, it makes sense that blood be offered as representing the life, and that be understood to be God's portion. And so again, we find it in all the cultures, or at least in a great many cultures of the earth, and we find it in Israel as well. And so Leviticus speaks about, and the book of Hebrews. Okay, how's it go?
Forgot the beginning part, but the life of the animal is in the blood.
Right, and therefore that's what's offered. Thank you. Okay. And so that offering of nourishment and blood to God represents all these things that are the purposes of sacrifice. Right? It represents first God's dominion. He's the source of life. And so that's why the blood is, in a sense, His. But it's also a way of giving thanks, offering something back, and thus offering a part of one's livelihood back to God. Not the whole, because we have to live, but the first fruits, the unblemished lamb. In other words, a kind of symbolic, a token of the whole, right? A part that represents the whole. And then it's also offered in sacrifice to make atonement, because we're depriving ourselves of something good voluntarily to make up for evil done and sin chosen. And then it's fitting in asking for blessings to give something so as to receive God's aid. Okay. Now, in Israel, that basic structure of sacrifice was present, but it was God gave it a specific form in the Mosaic covenant, and much of the Old Testament details the particular sacrifices. And so we're just going to go through it very briefly. The first 7 chapters of Leviticus are a kind of catechesis on the offering of sacrifices. Now, to us, people tend to, the first one too, I tend to skip over those chapters because those sacrifices can't be offered anymore. And so it seems less pertinent to read about them. But tonight we have to look at them because they're all representing Christ. They're part of. So today's gospel was the Christ on the way to Emmaus, and the 2 disciples. And Jesus opened up the scriptures to them. And I'm sure a part of what Jesus opened up to them that was about Him were the sacrifices of Israel, because they were all representing His passion and representing the Eucharist. And that's how the whole episode ends, with them recognizing Jesus in the breaking of the bread, which is Luke's code word for the Eucharist. So the first 7 books of Leviticus give the prescriptions for the different kinds of sacrifices. And so we find 5 different categories, as it were. Leviticus starts with burnt offering. So these are kind of the general categories of sacrifice. And they were sacrifices that the Israelites could freely offer to obtain for those 4 reasons that we said: to adore, in thanksgiving for benefits received, in atonement, propitiation for sin, and to win blessings or particular petitions. And so they were free will offerings. And the first kind is the burnt offering. So in the burnt offering, an animal is offered and totally consumed by fire, so that the whole goes to God. And so the person offering loses it entirely. And so it represents a more serious offering, because you don't get anything back, and it's all given to the Lord. So a holocaust, burnt up. And that has a particular... all the sacrifices represent Christ, but the burnt offering in a particular way, because Jesus gave himself holding nothing back, right, to the end. And so the burnt offering beautifully represents that. Now, in all of the offerings, there are certain common elements. Before the offering, the offerer puts his hand on the head of the animal to indicate solidarity. In other words, that the animal is in some sense representing the one offering. It's representing the interior offering of the heart. So it establishes solidarity. And the blood is poured out. And the blood is thrown against the altar, or poured out around the altar. And so indicating that the blood is for the Lord, the Lord's portion. In the burnt offering, then the whole animal is burnt. But in the other offerings, part of it is also consumed. The fat is given to so the fat portions are the Lord's portions. And then the meat could be eaten by the priests in some of the offerings, and also by the person offering, if it's what's called the peace offering. So in the sin offerings, so there were offerings for inadvertent sins, that would be violating ritual purity, and also not guilt offerings. So sin offerings would be when it's not really a sin in our sense of the word sin, something deliberately chosen. But then there were also guilt offerings for things that were sins. And in both of those cases, the person offering didn't get anything back. The fat was burnt for the Lord, and the priest would eat the meat of the sacrifice. Again, showing that solidarity that the priest is offering on behalf of the people. And then there were cereal offerings also. And so the cereal offering would be an offering of unleavened bread with oil, and that would be partially burnt for the Lord, and then part of it would be eaten by the priest. And so it would be consecrated by the offering and be the priest's portion. And so all of them are representing Christ in different ways. The cereal offering, because it represents the sensible part of the Eucharist, the species of bread being offered that becomes his body. But the animal sacrifice is representing more directly his bloody sacrifice, right, with the blood being poured out. And then we said the burnt offering represents his total gift, but the peace offering, in which the one offering eats the meat of the sacrificed animal, that also represents the Eucharist, precisely the aspect of communion. Right? So we can see that that's actually a very important part of the sacrificial system, that Israel does partake of the sacrifices. And because we said the purpose of sacrifice is to establish this fellowship with God. And so fellowship in every culture, but in particularly ancient cultures, was solidified by eating together. Right? If you eat together, if you share a meal, that makes a bond. That if you then betray that bond, that becomes something blasphemous. And so eating the portion, a part of the sacrifice offering to God, is symbolizing eating with God. In other words, entering into fellowship with Him, which was the privilege of Israel as the chosen people. And so that too is prefiguring Holy Communion. Of course, there's a difference. What the Israelites ate was the meat of bulls and lambs and nothing more. And what we receive in communion is the Lamb of God, Jesus Christ. Okay, so those were the general types of sacrifices that we find in the first 7 books of Leviticus. But then the other chapters of Leviticus and also Numbers and Exodus speak about the particular offerings for the particular feast days. And so every day, there was an offering for every day. So every day there was a 1-year-old lamb offered morning and evening, together with an offering of unleavened bread and wine. Again, magnificent symbol, right? Because we've got the bread and the wine representing the sensible aspect of the Eucharist, and then we have the bloody offering of the lamb representing precisely Christ's bloody offering made present on the altar in the Eucharist. So that was offered twice a day. On the Sabbath, it was offered double. So 2 lambs, morning and evening, and a double portion of unleavened bread and wine. On the first of the month, the new moon, it would be, I think, 2, anyway, it's multiplied. 7, can I give it here? 2 young bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, a year old without blemish. And then a corresponding increase of the bread and the wine. And on other feast days, there's even more. And then the feast, so the principal feast days would be Passover, Pentecost, which Jews speak of as the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot. That was marked by sacrifice. And also the offering of cereal offering. Each family would bring the first fruits of their harvest, of their barley or wheat harvest. And so it would be a cereal offering in large quantities because every family is bringing it. And also the offering of lambs and bulls. And then the feast of, what's called the Feast of Trumpets, which refers to the shofar. We call it Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, the beginning of the 7th month. 7's a sacred number. Also is marked by the offering of many sacrifices in the temple. And then the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, even more sacrifices. I'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's the Feast of Booths, or Tabernacles, the week-long feast in which Jews live in and take their meals in a kind of a booth outside their normal dwelling, with branches for roof. That was also marked by a large number of sacrifices in the temple. So every Jewish feast has that sacrificial dimension very much underlined. And the most prolific would be Passover and the Day of Atonement. In different ways, though. So Passover for the sheer quantity of the offerings, because every household had to bring a Paschal lamb. Right? So every group of 10, and they had to, if they could, go to Jerusalem and have it offered in the temple. So it wasn't something you could do in, say, Nazareth or Bethlehem. You had to go to Jerusalem for it to be sacrificed in the temple. And every household had to do this. So we don't know the exact population of Israel, but it's estimated, Josephus, the historian, who's writing in the 1st century AD, a few decades after Jesus' death, he estimates that some 2 million pilgrims came to Jerusalem a few years before the temple was destroyed. All right, maybe that's exaggerated. Let's take it a half of it, 1 million. If 1 million pilgrims come to Jerusalem, each group of, say, 10 or 15 offers a lamb, you've got a very large number of lambs. Something like 50,000 being offered in one afternoon in the temple. Right? So an incredible quantity of blood being spilled out for the Lord. And again, it's hard for us to wrap our imaginations around it. So some 50,000 lamb sacrifices. And in addition to that, there were special sacrifices, like on the Sabbath, for each day of the Passover, for all 7 days. And by the way, we'll talk about this next week when we look at the Passion narrative and the day of the Last Supper. But you can see that on Good Friday morning, the priests don't want to enter into the praetorium with Caiaphas because they don't want to become ritually impure, so that they could eat the Passover. Well, it seems that the priests couldn't be ritually impure because they had to offer various sacrifices, 7 lambs and so forth, each day of the Passover. We'll come back to that next week.
Was it you that told us about the measures of water that were used to wash the blood off?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know the measures of water, but there was a very complicated system to bring water into the temple court. I don't know the details of it.
Flowed out the side.
Yeah. Clearly, something like that would have to be done. Okay.
Were these
Mm-hmm.
were the offerings every day, or is it only every day during a feast?
No, every day, twice a day, and then the feasts multiply on top of that, are adding to that. Right, so the greatest number would be the Passover, but the Day of Atonement would have a greater solemnity because it's being the victims are being offered in a solemn way in atonement for the priest, his family, and for the whole people, and that's where you get the scapegoat. So let's look at that. So Leviticus 16 gives the prescriptions for the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur. And so the high priest, this was the one time that the high priest would enter into the Holy of Holies. Every other day, the priest would go only into the sanctuary that's right before the Holy of Holies. So the Holy of Holies is covered with a veil, like this rich, thick veil, keeping the Holy of Holies veiled in mystery. And he would offer incense and bread in the sanctuary, but not in the Holy of Holies. Only on the Day of Atonement would he enter into the Holy of Holies behind the veil and with the blood of various sacrifices. So the blood of a bull to atone for his own sins and those of his house. And the blood, there were 2 goats. So one goat was, by lot, chosen to be sacrificed, and the blood brought into the sanctuary, into the Holy of Holies, and sprinkled on the very mercy seat. The mercy seat is what covered the Ark of the Covenant. And so you have the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies. On top of it, the mercy seat, and then 2 cherubim on either side, representing the mercy of God. And so the high priest would sprinkle with the blood of those 2 sacrifices for his sins and the sins of the people onto the mercy seat itself. And that would be the one time when the high priest would pronounce the holy name of God, the Tetragrammaton, right, the name that God revealed to Moses, prostrate with and not without blood. And then when he would come out, there would be the offering of the scapegoat. So the priest would place his hands on the scapegoat, again in sign of solidarity, and also signifying the putting all the sins of Israel of that year onto the scapegoat, who would carry those sins and be sent out into the wilderness to perish there. It's a unique kind of sacrifice representing vicarious atonement. And so again, it's a magnificent type of Christ's carrying the sins not just of Israel, not just of all the people at that time, but of all the sins of all of history. Right? And being sent out of the camp, as it were, crucified outside Jerusalem. So we can see the scapegoat as a type of Christ, but all the sacrifices, right? The blood sprinkled before the mercy seat is, again, representing Christ's blood. And the letter to the Hebrews basically is a large part of it is showing the typology of the Day of Atonement, how that's prefiguring Christ's sacrifice. And so Christ enters not through a physical veil into a physical Holy of Holies, but he goes through in death through the veil of, above all, in his death, resurrection, and ascension, seating himself at the right hand of God, he goes through the veil, as it were, of all of this creation, right? So as to enter beyond the veil into heaven, from which to intercede for us. Okay. So let's think a little more about we have a sense of the quantity of that blood. On certain occasions, it was even greater. And the most solemn was the dedication of the temple itself. So when Solomon built the temple, the book of Chronicles tell us that Solomon had 22,000 oxen sacrificed and 120,000 lambs. Again, it's unimaginable. And all of that blood poured out, and so the number of priests, and just the sheer, so to our mind, so our utilitarian sensibilities, like Judas, right? Judas with the Mary Magdalene pouring out the lotion on Jesus' feet. Think of what that could have fed, and anyway, all of this to show that the glory of God is, it's worth it to. And that sacrifice is doing a key function that infinitely transcends mere utilitarian considerations, because it's restoring man's right relationship with God. But the tragedy, of course, is that all of these, no matter how many you offer, 120,000 lambs, it's still how insufficient? Infinitely. So the sheer quantity itself is very instructive, right? Because it's showing us that even all of that is not enough, but it's still necessary, right? Necessary but not enough. And so all of that is pointing to another blood that would be sufficient, and not just sufficient, but superabundant, right? The blood of Christ. And then I think the fact that Israel lost the sacrifices when the temple was destroyed is not without an effect, I think, on it's the very nature of the liturgy, that the liturgy instructs not by words but by deeds, by what's sensibly represented. And so the sensible fact of all that blood being poured out on the altar in adoration to God forms the mind in two things. We could say in four things: that the need to adore God, the need to give Him something is a token of gratitude, but above all, the need to make satisfaction for sin, right? And then to accompany our prayers. So all of that blood was reinforcing that idea that we have a fundamental obligation to offer something to God back, and that it has to have, after sin has entered the world, that aspect of making satisfaction for sin. And so all of that blood was also showing that sin is something, how bad? So bad that all of that blood needs to be offered and is insufficient. And therefore sin is a big deal. I think the loss, now obviously this is speculation, but I'm taking this from a Jewish theologian. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Vishograd? Do you know, David? Vishograd. So he speaks about why is it that very often, especially in secular Jews, the concept of sin is very often regarded as a Christian idea. Now that's totally false, right? Sin is there's nothing more Jewish than the notion of sin. That's why all these sacrifices are being offered. Right, that too. So how is it that many Jews see the notion of sin as a Christian idea. Well, there are obviously many causes for this, but he speculates one possible cause may be the fact that the atonement for sin is no longer liturgically represented in Judaism. It simply can't be. Not because of any infidelity on the part of Israel. It's precisely because of their fidelity to the Mosaic covenant that they're not offering sacrifice. God has not permitted them to offer it. And of course they see that as the greatest tragedy of Israel, that the temple was destroyed and that sacrifice. So for an Orthodox Jew, the destruction of the temple is mourned every year. There's a special feast, the 9th of Av, the month of Av falls in the summer, in which they remember the destruction of Jerusalem, and then they add to it all the other catastrophes that have afflicted Israel over the centuries. But the greatest being the loss of the ability to sacrifice.
So once the temple was destroyed, they just lost that whole thing? They
Yeah.
didn't replace it with
Couldn't, because to replace it would have been infidelity to the Mosaic covenant, because the covenant says it could only be offered in the place that God appointed. And therefore they were dependent totally on God's providence in providing that place for sacrifice to be offered. Now that's a beautiful example for us, right? It's not something, for an Orthodox Jew, sacrifice isn't something that we do on our own accord. It's done because God has commanded it, when He's commanded it, where He's commanded it, and by whom He's commanded it. And the problem is the where no longer exists.
So in their minds, are they just carrying this burden?
Absolutely. Sure.
Oh my God.
Right. So, I mean, there's obviously the hope that the fidelity to the law in other things, and above all in prayer, can compensate for the fact that sacrifice can't be offered. But it ought to be seen as the greatest of tragedies. Right? We see this for example, in the time of the Babylonian exile. Daniel. So Daniel chapter 9 has a magnificent prayer of the prophet Daniel, where he's just pouring out his tears because sacrifice can no longer be offered because of the sins of Israel that merited the loss of the temple, and therefore the loss of the way to placate God for the sins of Israel. It's a vicious circle, right? The sins of Israel have the ultimate effect, once they get to a certain point, of resulting in the loss of the very ability to offer something to seek to make amends. Now, God obviously always accepts the humbled and contrite heart, right? The interior offering. But it's still a great tragedy that it can't be accompanied by the exterior representation. Right? Now, Reformed Jews don't have that sense of loss about that. They think it's human progress that we don't offer animal sacrifices anymore. But for the Orthodox, no. Right? That's tragedy of the highest sort. Now, it's interesting. Let's go back to this. So why, we might ask, did God so command that in such a strict way that all sacrifice be offered only in one place, the place that God provided, and when that place no longer existed, that it couldn't be offered? Why did He so strictly tie the offering of sacrifice to the temple? That's a good question. And we don't actually know because He doesn't directly tell us. But theologians like to pose these questions and try to give answers. So I'm going to try and do that. So it seems to me there are several reasons for it, not just one. The first reason is that, an obvious kind of reason, it gave a unity to the worship of Israel. That all sacrifice had to be offered in one place, under one authority, the high priesthood. Right? So it enabled the worship of Israel not to degenerate into syncretism, into whatever, which is what ended up happening anyway in the centuries between David and the exile. Like that's precisely one of the key things that led to the Babylonian captivity, was that they didn't offer sacrifices only in the temple, but they offered them on all the high places, which is what, in other words, the pagan peoples would offer sacrifice in particular places in nature that had a certain grandeur. So the high places, in other words, the mountaintop, the hilltop, was a traditional place for the offering of sacrifice. So we read about the prophets constantly denouncing the people offering sacrifice on those high places or before the oak tree, or etc. And so it enabled the sacrifice to be unified. That'd be one reason. But symbolically, it represents that all sacrifice had to be offered in one place was a type of the fact that even though there were many sacrifices offered, that they could only be offered in the temple, gave a unity to the sacrifices of Israel that enabled it to better serve as a type of Christ's one sacrifice and the one sacrifice of the church. So in the church, there's only one sacrifice offered in every altar. Right? So in sacrifice here this morning, I was at the seminary. In China, it's everywhere the same sacrifice because it's the same Christ in his body and blood, not a different body, not a different blood, the same body and blood present on every altar. So we have, in effect, today, the inverse of Israel. They had many lambs and bulls in one place. We have many, many places, in fact, all the places in the earth, practically, hopefully, but one sacrifice offered there. So it seems that was a way of prefiguring that. And then it was showing another thing, showing that the offering of sacrifice is tied to the indwelling of God. So the Eucharist has these three dimensions: sacrifice, spiritual nourishment, and presence. But they all go together. It's the same Eucharist that is presence, nourishment, and sacrifice. It's the same body of Christ that is all three. In Israel, they couldn't be the same. The temple is one thing, the sacrifice is another, the spiritual nourishment was another. But the unity of place at least brought them together. So sacrifice could only be offered before the face of God. Right? So that basically is the reason, I think. I've gone way over time. One last thing before I end. One other figure of the Eucharist is the solemn sealing of the covenant at Mount Sinai. So when Israel came to Mount Sinai for sealing the Mosaic covenant, Moses ordered that various bulls, I suppose 12 bulls, be sacrificed for the 12 tribes, and the blood was gathered into basins, half of it poured out on the altar, and half sprinkled on the people. Very interesting. And so it's the only time we see the blood being received here by the people, not as we receive Christ's blood in communion, but in some way receiving it as a sprinkling. And so again, what would be the purpose of that? A covenant involves a union or fellowship. And so the blood being God's portion, the fact that it's sprinkled on the people is a sign of the people being brought into fellowship with God and brought into a share of that life which is properly His. So that sprinkling of the blood on the people is also a magnificent type of Holy Communion. But there's huge differences. So it's what's common is that it was a solemn sealing of a covenant by which the blood was shared. God's portion also sprinkled on the people. In Holy Communion, it's taken to the nth degree. So it's not bulls of blood, which would be God's portion, but it's God's blood. And so God becomes man, pours out His blood. So that blood, even though it's obviously human blood, it's nevertheless the blood of a divine person in His human nature. So we can call it God's blood. And it's not sprinkled on us, but it's given to us whole and entire to be our portion. And not just to the priests, but to all the faithful. Right? And so that's a way of manifesting, and since it's the new covenant, it does what it manifests. It manifests that we share God's own life. And since it's the sacrament of the new covenant, it does what it represents. In other words, it's precisely the divine means for giving us a progressive share in God's own life. So we'll end it there and take a break and questions. Thank you.
Oh man, you're in trouble this time.
Okay. You need some paper.
Yeah.
Need a pen?